I welcome you to this program this evening, the library story from grocery store to gigabytes. For me, I worked at the library for about 19 years now, and the library story is all about community and partnerships. And this evening is a perfect example of that. This evening's program is a co-sponsorship between the Ames Public Library and the Ames Historical Society. We've worked well together for years, and we're so excited that even though our building is very much in a state of disarray, we're able to put our heads together and our resources together to continue to offer programming to you. I hope that before you leave this evening, you'll not only chat with one another and have some refreshments, which are provided in the back of the room, but also take a look at some of the material that we have about the Ames Historical Society as well as the Ames Public Library. We have all kinds of programming happening this summer, and are excited to see you often here and at the library. So at this point, what I would like to do is ask you to please join me in welcoming this evening our speaker, Kathy Svec, who is currently the co-president of the board of the Ames Historical Society, as well as a volunteer there. Kathy has prepared this program and offered it in the community before, and I wasn't able to see it myself, and so this is partly a selfish evening because I really did want to see this presentation, and I thought others would share that interest with me, and I was right. So please do welcome with me today Kathy Svec.
Mary, I did have one additional announcement about upcoming events at Hoggett School this summer. This is our one-room schoolhouse museum located at 18th and Burnett, and there's a flyer over here on the table. We have a program every Sunday afternoon through the end of August, and there are some wonderful programs coming up. And those of you who have heard Bob Bourne talk about trains and Ames before, he is speaking this Sunday on that subject at 2:15 up at Hoggett School. So pick up a schedule and bring your friends and neighbors and grandkids. They'll really enjoy it. I'd like to start today with a brief reading by a young woman who grew up in Ames. Susan Allen Toth grew up here and graduated from Ames High School in 1957. She has written a number of books, one of which is a reminiscence of her childhood years here in Ames called Blooming. Now here is her recollection of the Ames Public Library. The library, I remember, was a marble sanctuary ruled absolutely by a white-haired priestess whose initiates, also women, found themselves sworn to whispers and lifelong devotion. In the Ames Public Library, we learned to worship the world of books. I gave myself to it so completely that I came to believe that it had to correspond, if sometimes obliquely, to the world of real life. Sisters ought to be loving and playful like the March girls in Little Women. Nurses were selfless and devoted like Sue Barton. Dogs were nicer than people like Lad of Sunnybank. Unhappy children found rich protectors, as did Sarah Crewe in A Little Princess. Somewhere around a corner, anyone might stumble upon her own secret garden. I was convinced that every locked door would open to a magic password. Even today, when I see a certain kind of oriental rug, I can feel a momentary belief that at night it flies. So when I enter a library, even a commonplace one, I still have a reassuring sense that it is going to tell me all that I need to know. Whenever I hear the words inner sanctum, I think of the Ames Public Library. It was a massive stone temple with imposing front steps. Entering, I could feel its compelling power immediately. Now that same sentiment must have been in the hearts of the early residents of Ames who sought to create an inner sanctum for the residents that lived here. Tonight I'm going to tell you the tale of how Ames got its library, and especially how Ames women diligently organized to pursue this important community resource and how they enhanced it once it arrived. The library's beginnings were modest. But early citizens of all kinds showed their interest and commitment. Ames was established in 1864, and in 1886, a grocery business on Main Street called Maxwell Sons designated a room for use as a subscription library, no doubt inspiring residents to start thinking about a real library. Maxwell's service lasted for several years. About 5 years later, in 1891, a woman agent from the Excelsior Library Bureau of Chicago came to Ames and canvassed local residents and secured subscriptions for a public library that ensured a collection of nearly 100 volumes. So the next year, 1892, the first Library Association in Ames was formed by a group that met in Rowena and John Stevens' home at 9th and Douglas. The association's purpose was to provide valuable reading materials, a suitable location, and an efficient librarian. Among the 8 officers selected, 5 were women and included meeting hostess Rowena Stevens, who was well known in Ames and Boone for her active work for women's suffrage. The Ames Library Association members pledged $10 each to support a library and reading room for 1 year, renewable annually. Members were entitled to library circulating privileges for an annual fee of $1. For books, the association maintained a contract with the Library Bureau in Chicago. In 1897, from November 1893 to April 1894, the library was in the back of the Ames Drug Company at the corner of Main Street and Douglas, with the association providing shelves. Eugene Taylor, an Ames news dealer, served as librarian for $1 a month. So if you can read this sign right here, it says drugstore. In 1894, Ames residents were asked to approve a tax to establish a municipal library, but in the grand Ames tradition, it was not approved. See, we've been doing this for a long time. The next year, the library moved to the YMC League, where there was space for both a reading room and a library. In 1897, the library moved again to the News Depot near the train tracks, owned by Mr. Kuser, who also acted as librarian. Now this was, I think, the grandfather of Ted Kuser, our former U.S. Poet Laureate. In 1897, the collection numbered 392 books. The Library Association incorporated in 1897 to provide continuous rather than annual support for library services, and shares of stock were sold at $3 each. Each shareholder had a vote at meetings as well as circulation privileges. Significantly, Chapter AA of the PEO Society bought 33 shares of stock and voted $2 per month toward keeping the reading room open. The PEO paid the librarian's salary in 1897 and 98, and over the years presented musicals, lecture courses, and socials to benefit the library. A report in the Ames Evening Times on the Library Association's decision to incorporate recorded this statement by the president, quote, "Bear in mind that the association has not been organized to shut anybody away, but to make such things a success requires money. And money comes best to those who give something to show for it. Very few of those who have interested themselves in this enterprise has done so for personal advantages, but rather that Ames may have a library. The organization needs your help. Decide that you can take 1 or more shares, and when a committee member asks, do not hesitate, but subscribe and thus ensure the success of the undertaking," unquote. Now this is really a star-studded cast, the PEO Musicale. Mary Greeley is the hostess, playing the pianola, which is a player-type piano. Here's Mrs. Meeker, connected with the college. Mrs. Clyde Williams, who was the wife of one of the early college athletic coaches. There's Mrs. Meeker again. Mrs. Lydia Brown, she was Farwell's grandmother. Aunt. Thank you.
Lydia Brown.
Miss Lydia Brown, yes. Mrs. Williams and Mrs. Greeley. So quite a star-studded cast of residents supporting the library. In 1898, Dugan's Jewelry on Main Street designated some shelves and allowed people to run an exchange library. Dugan's was located at 213 Main, where Ames Christian Supply is today. That year, a minstrel show benefit titled The Black 400 earned $60 towards securing books. Now the next location, now you can see the library was really on the move in the earlier years. So the next location for the library was the upper room of the small town hall, space the city council gave for free. Association members worked hard to get the room in shape, donating materials and labor. It was open for 3 hours a week. Myron Blackman, son of the Baptist minister, was paid $1 a week and an additional 50 cents for cleaning. In 1900, another attempt was made to have City Council place a vote on the ballot for funding a free public library, but the council did not act on it that year. See this trend? Now this picture is of the first Ames City Hall, and there was space for the fire wagon down below. This was a meeting room for City Council up above. And this is the little 2-cell city jail right next door. Pretty fancy thing, don't you think? Probably. It's my understanding that the living conditions in this upstairs room were so inhospitable that City Council rarely used it. So it probably was quite a generous gesture for them to let the library have it. It stood at 5th and Kellogg, where the next City Hall stood, so it was happily demolished in time to put up the new City Hall. By 1902, the library was completely without suitable quarters, and the books were stored at the Central School building and the furniture was at Greeley's barn. That year, 1902, the PEO appointed a library committee to devise ways of establishing a free public library. The committee included Julia Stanton, Mary Greeley, Lydia Tilden, Mrs. Josephine Beardshire, wife of the college president, and Mrs. M.K. Smith, wife of a former mayor. The PEO's library committee remained active for 20 years and continued to be a force in library development. The PEO committee approached Mayor Parley Sheldon, who was supportive, and with assistance from Library Committee President Julia Stanton, the mayor wrote to Andrew Carnegie. Several drafts of that letter in Julia's handwriting still exist in the library's archive. The letter stated that the population was 3,500 and, quote, "It is a growing railroad center of the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, is exceedingly prosperous, and is considered by all as giving promise of becoming one of the larger cities of central Iowa. The people are energetic, progressive, and thoroughly interested in all matters that relate to the intellectual and social development of the city. They will appreciate the advantage of a library and will heartily support it," unquote. In February 1903, a gift of $10,000 was offered by the Andrew Carnegie Foundation. That is, if local citizens would agree to appropriate at least $1,000 annually to fund operations. In March 1903, that referendum passed. An article in the paper stated, quote, "Surely anyone who would turn down a gift of $10,000 to our city ought to be ashamed to look a yellow dog in the face." A terrible threat, for sure. Now this election was especially noteworthy because the women of Ames were allowed to vote, 16 years before the passage of the 19th Amendment. Allowing that vote was a way to recognize the important role women had played in library development up until that time, and to recognize that women deserved to have a say in a tax increase. Post-election reports noted that women voters had fewer spoiled ballots than men. Several locations for a library were offered for sale by downtown landowners, but the city accepted the donation of land at 6th and Douglas that was offered by Mary and Wallace Greeley. Mary became a member of the first library board and served until she died in 1915. Women board members were Mrs. M.K. Smith, Julia Stanton, and Myrtle Lanning. as well as merchants George Judish, J.J. Grove, Galen Tilden, John Judge, and O.H. Cessna from Iowa State. Now this picture is looking up Douglas Avenue, and then this is 5th Street right here. Those beautiful trees kind of obscure what you can see, but it's definitely the neighborhood where the library was to be built. Now I mentioned board member Myrtle Lanning, and Myrt is a continuing character in the library story, and I want you to remember her name because I'm going to mention her again. Lorena Weber was hired as the first librarian for $25 a month. She was an Iowa State College graduate who received her library degree from the University of Illinois. Weber cataloged the old books and worked with the committee to select new ones. Book donations were solicited, as were gifts of money to buy books. Hallett and Rawson Architects of Des Moines were hired to draw up building plans, and ground was broken in 1903. Professor Anson Marston, head of engineering at Iowa State, agreed to oversee the construction for no charge. The library building was on 2 levels. On the first floor, the checkout desk was immediately visible upon entering. The general reading room was to the right, the juvenile room to the left. The stack area and librarian's office were behind the desk. In the basement was an 87-seat lecture room and service areas. The library dedication was held September 16, 1904. However, the library was not quite ready for business for a month. Reason? Not enough books. There were 500 volumes from the old library, but 3,000 were needed to fill the new building. Operations money approved by citizens, amazingly, did not include funding for acquisitions. Oops. Citizens responded to an appeal for books and donations so that the library could open. The collection numbered 1,435 books in January 1905 and 2,306 by the end of 1905. Among the most popular fiction books of 1904 were Ben-Hur, Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, and Jack London's Call of the Wild. 2 members of a literary club called Book and Basket, Mrs. M.K. Smith and Grace May Holtz, adopted the library as their pet project and organized a benefit called A Tour of the World. In 1905, Lorena Weber was succeeded as head librarian by Kitty B. Freed, who served until 1924. Freed grew up in Ames and was an Iowa State graduate who trained at Columbia University and the New York City Library. In 1906, the annual library report stated, "It is a pleasure to note the decrease in fiction and the great increase in books on science and the useful arts. This is partly due to allowing the reader to take 2 books at a time, provided only one is fiction." Isn't that a great way to manage your collection? Don't have enough books, only let them take out one at a time. The library was so popular that the building was soon too small. Mayor Sheldon and Julia Stanton again wrote to the Carnegie Foundation for expansion funding. In 1907, voters approved a further levy of $600 annually, and the Carnegie Foundation added $6,000 to the original gift. The first edition opened in 1909, located on the southwest corner of the building. In 1911, PEO established a literature alcove with books donated by their members. PEO also donated a framed picture of Andrew Carnegie that hung behind the circulation desk for many years. In 1914, the Ames DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, gave a sundial to the library that was placed on a pedestal on the front lawn. The sundial was a duplicate of one that had belonged to William Brewster, pastor of Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts, an ancestor of the husband of a chapter member. In 1915, Mary Greeley died, and this tribute was recorded. She has been a cheerful worker, a modest but wise advisor, giving her best judgment, energy, and devotion to a cause she appreciated and loved. We know how helpful has been her unselfishness, her untiring faithfulness, and her optimistic vision of the work and its possibilities. Between 1924 and 1929, Olive Ryder, Grace Hill, and Winifred Wennerstrom took the head librarian spot. In 1928, stalwart supporter Julia Stanton passed away, having spent 24 tireless years on the library board. In 1929, Letha Davidson was appointed library director, marking the beginning of a long career at the library and the beginning of the contemporary era at Ames Public Library. Letha trained at Winona, Minnesota and the University of Wisconsin and had experience in Milwaukee and Des Moines before coming to Ames. Letha had special training and an intense interest in children's reading and was nationally known for her expertise. She became a children's book reviewer, and those books were added to the collection. In 1932, no doubt through Letha's influence, the Ames Women's Club gave a contribution for the improvement of the children's room, and this was not the last involvement by the Ames Women's Club with the library. The first well-attended Evening with Books was in 1936, an event planned and organized by the American Association of University Women until 1938. The year that she started at the library, 1929, Letha set up the first miniature display that became the beloved Little Theater, a tradition still loved by children and adults alike. I know I look at it every time I go in, and I hope all of you do too. As a matter of fact, Lynn Carey, where is the Little Theater?
It's at 809 East Lincoln.
It's in storage. It is in storage. But it's going to have a very spectacular display when the library reopens. Absolutely. Good. Library usage continued to grow, and by the 1930s, the space situation was absolutely desperate. The small structure could not house the collection of 21,000 volumes. When the library marked its 30th birthday in 1934, circulation was well over 90,000, considerably busier than in 1904 when just over 2,000 books were loaned. I want you to look at this picture. There are houses on either side. So that block was residential at the time the library was sitting there. In 1937, under Letha's leadership, a campaign started for expansion, and the lot west of the library was purchased. A bond issue for $85,000 passed on Valentine's Day, 1938, for an addition that would triple the size of the library. Construction began in 1939. During construction, books were stored above Moore Brothers Dairy at 5th and Clark, and the school board provided free use of their storage building at 5th and Burnett. The library functioned at this location on a limited basis with 8,000 books. See, Lynn, they've done this before. Kimball and Bowers were selected as architects, and Ben Cole and Son were general contractors, the same company that built the Grand Avenue underpass. Kimball and Bowers integrated the old with the new by designing a central limestone-faced portion and creating the appearance of wings on either side. One wing was the old library, over here, and the other was completely new, but a perfect mirror image. Next time you're walking past on 6th Street, just look and see how perfectly those two wings match. The new facility opened on March 31st, 1940. In the Carnegie Library area was a reading room and magazine racks. In the new addition were a welcoming children's room on the south and a young people's room on the north. There was a large stack area, offices, an exhibit room, and on the lower level a 300-seat auditorium with stage and kitchen. A child excited about the new library said, "It's swell! We have our own room where we can sniffle and shuffle all we want." The newspaper credited Letha Davidson's drive for the expansion and her experience that influenced the educational and cultural life of the community. The sundial was moved to a spot on the south lawn. In 1946, a large globe for the adult reading room was given in memory of Mrs. W.P. Nichols, a library board member. In May 1946, a branch library opened in Campustown to serve the residents of the 4th Ward, but it closed in 1950 due to low usage. So Letha began lobbying for a bookmobile, and it only took her 20 years to get it. Up until 1947, there had always been more female library users than male, but the influx of veterans taking advantage of the GI Bill after World War II tipped the balance toward the guys for the first time. This is Pamela Court, the married student housing complex that grew up on the north side of campus. All of these buildings were surplus. By the 1940s, Letha Davidson had instituted a program to interest young people in doing library work. Junior high and high school age students could apply to become a library assistant. Applicants were screened and interviewed. They had to be serious, devoted, and of high moral character. They were trained in library practices and in return agreed to work a steady number of hours after school and on weekends all through high school. Needless to say, the job carried a lot of cachet. Local resident Phyllis Harris remembered this. Anita Wald-Tuttle and I were 7th graders in Miss Davidson's apprentice class. We then worked at specific jobs for the library through high school into college. In other words, we were marked for life by Letha Davidson. This picture was taken in January 1952. Mrs. Melvin Haas, library assistant, is shown placing books on the new Otto Page drive-up book return. The book return was said to literally swallow books and at the same time place them in neat stacks ready for removal to the library shelves. Now, we did hear from one veteran book return emptier who said that the neat stacks claim really did not materialize. In 1953, Mrs. J.M. Elwell demonstrated the new Kodograph microfilm machine. 33 years of Ames Tribunes had been converted to film and were available for easy public perusal thanks to the new machine. The conversion to microfilm was financed jointly by the library and the Tribune. And they are a treasure indeed. The library still has those. Not the machine, just the microfilm. Thank you, Janet. In 1954, the library marked its 50th anniversary with parties and special events. Miss Davidson wanted to showcase library services and said to the anniversary planners, the Ames citizen doesn't realize just how much goes on at the library. And I think that's a statement that is still true today. For this celebration, library assistant Barbara Von Wittig created a miniature of the original 1904 library. The 36-inch by 25-inch creation featured small figurines in period dress, furniture and wall arrangements true to the original design, and 459 tiny books for the miniature stacks. Women's organizations that helped with the celebration were 5 PEO chapters, Faculty Women's Club, the Ames Cosmetologists, Readers Club, the AAUW, and Women of the Moose. Now, I mentioned Myrtle Lanning earlier, and we're back to Myrt. She was honored during the celebration. Lanning was a longtime Ames teacher at the Central School who served on the library board for 52 years, 1903 to 1955. In 1963, after 34 years of service, Letha Davidson retired. Her sister Margaret, 15 years younger, was appointed director. Margaret continued the tradition established by her sister of well-chosen literature and books that nurtured children's love of reading. With Letha and Margaret, just because a book was on the bestseller list did not mean that it was worthy of an expenditure of scarce public funds. In 1964, the library issued the first carrier-owned library card. Prior to that, cards were kept at the library. Library staff worried that patrons would lose their cards and then bad guys would find them and use them illegally. However, the cards were issued and the staff's fears were never realized. In 1966, the first bookmobile began operations, long a dream of Letha Davidson's. I'm glad she was still alive to see it. In 1968, Letha Davidson passed away. In 1971, a memorial committee selected Isabel Bloom to create a sculpture that would be of special significance to children. Bloom responded appropriately. The concrete sculpture with Venetian glass mosaic tiles of a child holding a book is truly a touchstone at the library. Now, it used to stand near the main office, and occasionally offerings were left on the open book. I just want to reassure you, the statue is safely in storage next to the Little Theater on East Lincoln, and will reappear when the library reopens. In 1973, Margaret and the library board began talking about the need for yet another expansion and began considering locations where the library could expand, a planning process that in true Ames fashion would take 10 years. In 1975, Margaret retired. Longtime co-worker Edna Brown remembered her and her sister Letha. They had such quick wit. They were true scholars, really quite unusual women. It was a privilege to have started out working for them. An interesting footnote in 1975 was prompted by the Ames chapter of NOW, the National Organization of Women. They influenced a change in library policy. Until that time, a married woman applying for a library card had to place her husband's name on the application. The Ames Human Relations Commission recommended even-handedness. If that information was requested from the woman, then then male married applicants would have to provide the wife's name. Following Margaret as director was Mona Carmack, who brought a new age of librarianship. On her second day, she lined up 10 aqua-colored clothes baskets at the top of the entry steps and created the first magazine exchange, a service that is still popular with library users. Does anyone remember that row of plastic laundry baskets up there? I know, I do. Mona soon filled the library with new and popular books and new formats, responding to the diverse needs and desires of taxpayers. During Mona's tenure, the Friends of the Library was established, and she continued to push for a building expansion as well as computerized circulation. In 1980, the city purchased Benson Motor Site, which was immediately south of the library, for the building project. In 1981, Mona left the library and Claire DeClean was hired, who stayed just 3 months. George Lawson served as interim and then was hired as director, the first male director since the city established a library building. I think these pictures are quite interesting. Here's the back of the library with the Benson Motors right next to it. And then this picture must have been taken like from this building, probably right the 3rd floor, looking north across the old auto place to the back of the library. That's a view you haven't seen for a long time. In 1981, Mary Bergerson of Gilbert checked out the 10 millionth item. Interestingly, a book on starting your own business. Go, Mary. The referendum for the addition went on the ballot in 1983 and was passed by 80% of voters. Groundbreaking took place in 1984 with Mayor Pro Tem Mary Atherley wielding the shovel. In April 1985, 1,022 volunteers moved 90,000 books in a book brigade, hand over hand, to the new edition. Is there anyone here who was in the brigade? All right, yes. Eager for that new edition to open. With the new edition opened with a dedication in September 1985. And with this edition, finally, the DAR sundial was moved to the patriotic area of the Ames Cemetery, where it has not moved, luckily, for quite a few years. And it is definitely still there. In 1985, Margaret Davidson passed away. She and her sister Letha had helped guide the library through 46 years of good times and tribulations. Margaret was described as somewhat of a character. She smoked. She hated to wear dresses. She took apart a washer and rebuilt it in order to write a paper. She sipped rum and sang Bach chorales in hotel rooms with her library conference friends. And she adored her cat, Wilbur. After trying to become a bacteriologist, she gave in and followed her mother and older sister to library work, her true calling. She and Letha were old school librarians who acquired those books they saw as good literature and nonfiction. You would not, for example, have found Nancy Drew mysteries in Letha and Margaret's library. In 1991, Mona Carmack's dream was realized when a $253,000 bond issue for a computerized online catalog passed the vote by Ames citizens. In 1992, George Lawson left the library and Sally Reed joined the staff in 1993, followed by Gina Millsap in 1996. Both Sally and Gina brought many innovative ideas to the library and struggled to keep pace with the demands of library users. Since 2001, the Ames Public Library has ranked in the top 10 nationally in circulation for cities our size. For example, in 2011, the collection consisted of 226,000 items that were circulated over 1,388 times. In 1993, 96, and 2003, the library received bequests from 3 women, Bessie and Gladys Myers and Verna Jane Thompson, totaling $1,265,000, funds that have had a huge impact on the library. This brings us to 2006, when Art Weeks joined the staff, and to today, when Lynn Carey is serving as interim director, and the library again faces the all-too-familiar challenge of lack of space. In 2008, Ames Public Library hired a library planner to assess space needs based on activity, proposed growth in Ames, and anticipated changes in library usage. After months of public meetings and input, a proposal was formulated and the question was put to a vote. Thankfully, the library is dear to the hearts of Ames citizens as they voted yes by an overwhelming 76% to the bond issue for the next renovation and expansion. And so, the next exciting chapter of library history begins to unfold. Thank you. Now, I would be very pleased to answer questions, and Lynn and Mary and library staff are in the audience, so maybe between us we can answer questions. Not quite. It's this. Well, hang on just a second. Is there a question in the audience? Anybody? Yes.
I don't have a question, but I always remember my young children when they went in the north door in the main entrance way back. Somehow they knew that if they made a noise, it would just echo. And I think many young children knew that.
You know, I think they did, and I read that little excerpt from Blooming at the very beginning. She also mentioned that echoey thing that went on when you stepped inside the door. You knew you were in a special place. Yeah, Kitty.
You solved a mystery for me. I never could figure out how I'd missed Nancy Drew books.
Dang, they just weren't there.
Is there a magazine exchange present?
Yes, there is. They did move that to the temporary edition. I know, I look in there every time I go in. I know Janet has something interesting for us.
This is something
Something different, okay?
We moved to Ames in 1975 with our 3 children. And what I remember from the building then, which was before the last edition, was that you had to ask for a key to get into the bathroom.
The key to the bathroom. Not good with kids, no. Oh my
So I was
gosh.
pleased that the restrooms were more accessible.
With the 85 edition, the bathroom's easy to get to. You know, that's another thing that Susan Toth mentions, and just how obvious it was.
That you were going to the bathroom.
Kidding.
When did the basement auditorium leave? I don't remember it growing up, that there was an auditorium there.
It was definitely down there, and it was changed. The usage was changed with the 1985 edition.
Well, and there was an art gallery too, leading to the auditorium.
And actually.
Did you hear that? An art gallery leading into the auditorium also.
And when we moved here, it had shelving in it. You know, because of the space needs.
Oh,
So there was
oh.
a lot of shelving in it.
So it sounds like it was converted to Stack's area also, where they were looking for every square foot of space they could find at that juncture. Yeah.
Is there any sense of how many Ames young people became librarians?
Oh, based on Letha's program, that library assistant program?
Just across the years?
Wow. I have no way, there's no way of knowing
Well,
that.
Dennis did.
Huh?
Dennis
Dennis did. Dennis Wendell is at least one example.
I have a file of recommendations for library school that's this thick from people who, in the 30 years that I've worked there, that I've written letters of recommendation for. They aren't in Ames, but they've gone out into the wider world as librarians. Pretty neat.
So having a fabulous library does influence interest in the field. Dennis?
It would be fun to have all the former and current librarians for staff.
That's what I wanted to do. And I'll go beyond that. Would all of the former and current library staff people please stand up? I just want to show what it takes to build a library. If you would stay up. Would all of the people who have ever been on a board at the library stand up?
Trustees, Board of Trustees members?
Would all of the current and former volunteers at the library stand up? Anyone who's ever donated to the library? That does include overdue fines. Anyone who's checked out a book at the library? And would anyone who is in a building across the street from the library tonight stand up?
Any other comments, remembrances, questions? Yeah.
I just remember you had to get a key and you wanted a book on sex. They were all
Yes. Yes, Letha. Kept them locked in her office, I understand. Yes. You knew you had taken a giant step when you were allowed into that cabinet. Indeed, indeed.
Well, it occurred to me when I started working at the Ames Public Library in 1988, I worked almost from the beginning with Farwell Brown on his collection of historic photos. And they were given to the library because at the time there was an historical society, but they didn't have the building or any of the fine facilities they have now. So that began a kind of tie between these two organizations. And as a result of working with him, cataloging his photographs, he published them in several books, which were published at Ames Public, right there. And I remembered in the third book, Ames in Word and Picture, that there was a story about K.W. Brown, who was Farwell's grandfather and the Civil War soldier of whom I spoke, about going to the library in Ames. And this is a library that Kathy missed. So I wanted to read just the part having to do with that. No, I know, but it fell out.
It fell out.
But I've got it here. Okay. Okay, this is chapter 38 of KW's part of this. This was a series of articles that originally were printed in the Ames Evening Times in 1915. And here's what he writes. This is called The Son of a King in Ames, Iowa, and it's all about running across the would-be king of Poland in the reading room in Ames. In the 1870s, the Women's Christian Temperance Union and other temperance workers were engaged in work all over Iowa to bring to the attention of citizens the necessity for outlawing saloons by means of an amendment to the Iowa Constitution. And KW, by the way, ran for governor of Iowa on the prohibition ticket. To that end, temperance advocates in Ames were maintaining a so-called public library in an upstairs room on the north side of Onondaga, which is Main Street. Under the leadership of the late Dr. Albert Richmond and a few other congenial spirits of reform, the WCTU reading room, as it was called, was kept open certain hours of each afternoon for many months. Whenever I was at home for a few days or during my vacation, I was in the habit of dropping in at the reading room for a few minutes as a diversion and as a means to encourage the temperance effort. I seldom remained long enough to sit down or become interested in a book or newspaper. At that time, 35 years ago, our city library was not the attractive and imposing structure inside and out that it is in these modern days of progress and enlargement. So he was writing this in 1915. So as Kathy pointed out to me earlier, that would include the Carnegie Library plus the 1908 edition. But you know, it continued to enlarge as it does today.
I just wanted to say that there are hundreds of local history stories as interesting as the one that you heard tonight. But putting them together takes time and resources. Memberships in Ames Historical Society provides those resources. If you are not a member, we hope you'll consider becoming a member to ensure the preservation of our collective past. We sincerely thank those in the audience who are already members. Your support means absolutely everything to us. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you so much. That was just wonderful, and I love being part of the continuing story, and you tell it so well, Kathy. We have a slide presentation of images that were just taken a few days ago of the construction activity happening right next door, so if you want to take a look at that, please do so. Stay, enjoy some refreshments. Thank you again so much, Kathy Svec and Ames Historical Society, and thank all of you for being part of our library.